Oh, it seems I have a visitor this evening. Welcome. The sky hangs clear and quiet tonight, the traveler watching silent over the city below. And I know you've come to rest beneath it. Take things slowly, and all will be well. I have some stories to share, ones that you may like. Are you all settled for this night? Good. Tonight we drift far from the last city, out past Savathûn and older worlds still, to a drowned planet called Fundament. There a small princess was born, who would one day wear 1,000 masks. She is a liar, a schemer, a god of the hive. They call her the Witch Queen, and this is the story of Savathûn. Far out beyond the edge of the last city, past the rings of Saturn and older worlds still, there floats a great ocean planet named Fundament. It is a gas giant so vast that a single one of its storms could swallow entire moons, and across its churning face rise continents made of solid gas, drifting slabs that carry seas and shorelines on their backs. Beneath those seas lived a small and short-lived people called the Krill. They were slender creatures with soft chitin and wide eyes, and they built their kingdoms in the crevices of these floating continents, always watching the tides, always afraid of the next great wave. Among the many Krill kingdoms, one belonged to the Osmium king, a ruler who dwelled in a court carved from bone and stone. He was old, far older than any Krill had a right to be, and the whispers in his halls said he had learned secrets that let him stretch his life beyond its natural span. The Osmium king had 3 daughters, and it is with these 3 daughters that our story truly begins. The eldest was Shiro, fierce and eager to prove her courage. The youngest was Orash, curious and clever, forever asking questions about the world above and the deep below. And between them stood the middle daughter, the one whose name will echo through this entire tale. Her name was Savathûn. Savathûn was a quiet child, watchful in a way her sisters were not. Where Shiro rushed toward danger and Orash chased after knowledge, Savathûn listened. She learned the rhythms of her father's court, the way the courtiers bowed, and the way they whispered when they thought no one heard. She noticed which servants lingered near the throne, and which ones carried messages in the dark. In a kingdom built on short lives and shorter memories, Savathûn remembered. The 3 sisters were raised together, and though the Krill were expected to live only a handful of years before laying their eggs and dying, the daughters of the Osmium king dreamed of more. Their tutor was a Krill named Teox, a servant of the court who had once served the Helium court before coming to the Osmium king. Teox taught the sisters what she knew, guiding them in the ways of their people, and for a time the 3 princesses trusted her as they trusted few others. She was a familiar presence in their childhood, a voice that shaped the way they saw the world around them. It was during this time that a strange thing washed up on the shores of the Osmium king's continent. The tide carried in the body of an enormous creature, a worm the size of a mountain, dead and rotting on the gas stone beach. The Osmium king came to look upon it, and something about it spoke to him. He took a piece of it, a fossilized remnant, and kept it close as a familiar. The worm whispered to him, and it told him of a coming disaster. A great tide was rising, larger than any before it, and when it came, it would drown all the kingdoms of Fundament and end the age of the Krill. The Osmium king grew fearful and secretive. He began to hoard knowledge and to trust fewer of those around him, and his court noticed. His paranoia became a wound in the heart of his kingdom, and there were those who watched it fester and saw in it an opportunity. Savathûn, ever watchful, felt the change in the air. She could not yet name the danger, but she sensed the way the courtiers looked at her father, the way old loyalties strained and bent. And so the daughters of the Osmium king came of age in a kingdom already sliding toward ruin, their father clutching his dead worm and his terrible prophecy, their tutor moving quietly through the halls with plans of her own. The great tide was coming, yes, but before the water ever rose, a betrayal was already taking shape beneath their feet, one that would tear the three sisters from their home and set them on a path from which none of them would ever return. Taox walked through the damp bone corridors of the Osmium court, and her claws clicked against the uneven floor plates. Water dripped from the ceiling arches and pooled in the grooves of the stone. She carried a sealed pact wrapped in dried kelp, representing a treaty forged with the Helium court, the rivals of the Osmium king. The Helium drinkers lived on a neighboring continent, and they wore thick armor crafted from deep-sea chitin, while wielding heavy, serrated blades that required 2 hands to swing. Taox guided a vanguard of these warriors through the unguarded service tunnels of the palace. She pointed her fingers down the corridors, showing the armored soldiers the direct path to the royal chambers. The Osmium king sat in his chamber, clutching the fossilized white worm. The wooden doors of his room splintered and shattered inward under the repeated blows of the Helium drinkers. The king stood and dropped the fossil. The invaders swung their serrated blades, piercing his soft chitin, and the old king collapsed onto the stone floor. Dark, thick fluid pooled beneath him and stained the grooved tiles. Taox stepped over the shattered wooden doors and entered the room. She looked down at the dead king. She turned to the commander of the Helium drinkers and signaled the warriors to secure the royal nursery, locate the mother jelly, and hunt down the 3 princesses. The mother jelly was a highly nutritious substance consumed by krill who wished to take the mother morph, a biological transformation allowing them to live longer and spawn children. Taox intended to hoard it for the Helium court. The screams of the palace guards reached the lower halls where Savathûn, Orash, and Shiro slept in woven hammocks. Savathûn woke first, and she heard the clanking of heavy armor and the footsteps of the Helium drinkers echoing down the spiral staircases. She grabbed the edges of the hammocks and shook her sisters awake. Shiro sprang up and seized a metal cleaver from the wall rack, while Orash ran to the study tables, gathering the thick, rolled navigational charts of the fundament oceans and shoving them into a satchel. Savathûn ran up the spiral staircase toward her father's chambers, passing dead guards lying on the stone steps. Reaching the threshold of the royal room, she saw her father's body, with dark fluid covering the floor. Beside his hand lay the white, fossilized worm. Savathûn dropped to her knees and picked it up, feeling its calcified surface against her palm. She heard the metal boots of the Helium drinkers approaching down the main corridor, so she pushed herself up, turned, and sprinted back down the stairs to her sisters. The 3 krill princesses fled through the rear arches of the palace. They ran across the open courtyard, and their bare feet slapped against the wet stone. Behind them, the tapestries and banners of the Osmium court burned, sending thick black smoke into the methane-heavy air. Helium drinkers swarmed the upper balconies, their blades catching the dim light of the cloudy sky. The sisters avoided the main thoroughfares, pressing their backs against the damp walls of narrow alleys and sliding down the craggy cliffs at the edge of the floating continent. Loose rocks tumbled down the cliffside and splashed into the churning water below. At the base of the cliffs, a small wooden skiff bobbed in the violent surf. The waves crashed against the hull, spraying salty mist into the air. The sisters climbed aboard. Orash took the helm, her hands gripping the wooden steering levers. Shiro stood at the stern, holding her cleaver tight, and she tracked the armored figures of the helium drinkers appearing on the cliff edges high above. Savathûn stood in the center of the rocking skiff. She looked back at the burning osmium court, watching the smoke billow into the sky. She held the fossilized worm against her chest, her fingers curling around its segmented body. The wind whipped her thin cloak around her shoulders and snapped the fabric loudly. She raised her free hand and touched her face, pressing her index finger against her right eye. "I am Savathûn, middle daughter of the dead king," she said, her voice cutting through the roar of the crashing waves. "I will take back my home and eat the mother jelly. I will raise my spawn on the corpse of the helium king. On my right eye, I promise this." Orash pushed the steering levers forward. The skiff lurched and broke through the crest of a massive wave. They steered away from the floating continent, driving the small vessel out into the open waters of Fundament. The sky above turned purple and black, filled with the thick clouds of the gas giant. Methane rain began to fall in heavy sheets, drumming loudly against the wooden deck and soaking the sisters' clothing. Savathûn looked down at the fossil in her hands, pressing the rigid segments of the dead creature deeply into her skin. She heard a sound, a faint, rhythmic vibration emanating from the stone. It was a whisper, slow and steady, vibrating directly against the bones of her hand. The sisters left the burning lights of their home far behind as they plunged the skiff further out into the raging seas. The waves swelled higher, lifting the small boat and sending it crashing down into the dark troughs of the ocean, moving them steadily away from the shores they once knew. The sisters navigated their wooden skiff across the violent surface of Fundament for many days, fighting massive swells and torrential methane rain. The fossilized worm in Savathûn's hand vibrated constantly, pulsing against her skin and guiding her through the storms. It led them to a jagged expanse of dark metal jutting from the frothing waves. This was a needle ship, an ancient, abandoned vessel built by a forgotten species. The hull was slick with algae and scored by the acidic rain. She-Ro climbed the side, gripping the rusted handholds, and pried open a heavy exterior airlock. Savathûn and Orash followed her inside, leaving their wooden skiff to be smashed by the rising tide. Inside, the air smelled of stale ozone and metallic dust. Orash found the central control room. She ran her hands over the dust-covered consoles, pulling heavy brass levers and pressing glowing glass buttons. Deep within the ship, the ancient engines ignited. A low hum vibrated through the floor grates. Orash pushed the main steering column forward. The needle ship tilted its sharp nose down and plunged beneath the churning surface of the ocean. The light from the surface faded rapidly, replaced by the crushing black of the deep waters. The needle on the pressure gauge spun as the ship descended layer by layer. The thick metal hull groaned, popping and creaking under the immense weight of the ocean above. The temperature inside the cabin plummeted. Condensation formed on the metal walls, freezing into thin, jagged sheets of ice. She-Ro paced the narrow corridors of the ship. She gripped her metal cleaver, her claws clicking against the floor grates. She watched the thick glass viewports, tracking the occasional bursts of bioluminescence from deep-sea predators swimming past in the dark. In the dim light of the control room, Savathûn sat perfectly still. She pressed the white, fossilized worm against her jawbone. The calcified segments hummed. The worm transmitted coordinates and angles of descent directly into her skull through bone conduction. She relayed these numbers to Orash, calling out the adjustments over the roaring sound of the water rushing past the hull. Orash pulled the steering levers, navigating the ship around massive underwater cliffs and swirling thermal vents that spewed black, boiling liquid into the cold ocean. They descended for weeks. The sisters grew thin, their soft chitin turning pale in the total darkness. They conserved the ship's meager rations, eating only enough to maintain their strength. The pressure outside grew so intense that the thick glass of the viewports began to warp inward. As the needle ship neared the planetary core, a massive shape materialized in the black water, blocking their downward path. It was a creature of immense scale, larger than the floating continents they had left behind on the surface. Thick, armored scales covered its broad back. Electrical currents arched across its massive fins, illuminating the dark ocean with blinding flashes of blue and white light. This was the Leviathan. It moved its colossal tendrils, churning the water and generating powerful currents that pushed violently against the nose of the needle ship. The ship's engine gears ground together loudly as Orash fought to keep the vessel stabilized. The Leviathan generated a low-frequency magnetic pulse. The sound waves struck the hull of the needle ship, causing the metal walls to ring like a bell. The vibrations translated into words that rattled the sisters' teeth and echoed in their chests. The creature spoke of a philosophy it called the sky, a path of building, preserving, and living in peace. It commanded the sisters to turn their ship around, to ascend back to the surface, and to accept their natural, short lifespans. The Leviathan emitted another pulse, generating a massive wall of electrical energy in the water. It explained its purpose in the deep. It served as a warden, guarding the core of fundament. Below its massive body lay beings of immense power and insatiable hunger, imprisoned in the depths for millions of years to protect the wider universe. The Leviathan offered the sisters a choice, urging them to embrace the light and avoid the terrible entities waiting in the dark beneath its fins. Savathûn stood up from her seat in the dim cabin. She watched the bright electrical arcs flashing outside the warping glass. Orash's hands trembled on the brass levers as the ship shook violently in the creature's current. Shiro stood at the viewport, her grip tightening on the handle of her cleaver. Savathûn raised the fossilized worm to her face, pressing it hard against her lips and feeling the rapid, frantic vibrations radiating from the dead stone. She walked to the control console and placed her hand over Orash's trembling fingers. She ordered her sister to push the levers to their maximum output. Orash shoved the heavy brass handles all the way forward. The needle ship's thrusters roared, burning a bright, blinding trail through the water. They aimed the sharp nose of the vessel away from the Leviathan's sweeping tendrils, diving straight down into the narrow, abyssal trench directly below the colossal beast. The water around the ship grew thick and hot as they broke past the electrical barrier, descending into the crushing black void to meet whatever waited for them at the very center of the world. The needle ship breached the electrical barrier, and the churning water gave way to a vast, hollow atmospheric pocket at the center of fundament. Orash pulled back the brass levers, and the ship's thrusters sputtered as it descended toward a solid surface composed of dark, compressed carbon. The air inside the cabin grew thick, and the walls radiated heat, causing the frost on the viewports to melt and pool on the metal floor grates. The sisters looked through the thick glass, wiping away the condensation with their palms. The glow of the ship's front lamps illuminated massive shapes coiled across the carbon floor, moving in the subterranean gloom. 5 enormous creatures lay in the cavern. They dwarfed the Leviathan above, their bodies stretching for miles across the crushed stone. Their bodies consisted of thick, chitinous segments, covered in barbed ridges and dripping with a viscous, black fluid that burned hissing holes through the carbon ground. The air outside the ship hummed with a low-frequency vibration, shaking the loose bolts in the needle ship's bulkheads. The largest of the five lifted its massive, plated head toward the viewing port. This was Yule, the honest worm. Beside him writhed Ea, Sol, Ua, and Akka. Akka bore deep, jagged scars across his hide, while thrashed endlessly against the cavern walls, sending showers of pulverized rock tumbling into the abyss. Their jaws opened, revealing concentric rings of hooked teeth extending deep into their glowing, cavernous throats. The worms communicated through bone-rattling vibrations that bypassed the ship's metal hull and struck directly into the sisters' skulls. The vibrations tasted like copper and smelled like rotting meat, filling the small cabin with the scent of ancient decay. Yule transmitted physical visions of the universe above into their minds. The sisters saw images of stars collapsing, galaxies spinning, and species consuming one another in dark, bloody oceans. The worm projected the physical reality of existence: predators tearing flesh from bone, harsh winds scouring rocks into dust, and fire consuming wet forests. Yule presented the Leviathan's path as a physical cage. He showed them images of civilizations trapped behind high walls, their bodies rotting from starvation and disease while waiting for a promised sanctuary. The traveler, the white moon in the sky above Fundament, appeared in their minds as a solid lead weight holding species down in the mud, forcing them into stagnation, weakness, and inevitable decay. The vibrations shifted, conveying the philosophy of the deep. Yule showed them blades striking armor, claws carving through bone, and strong creatures standing over the torn bodies of the weak. The worms offered a path of constant motion and physical consumption. They projected the logic of the universe as a sharp edge, cutting away the dead flesh to leave only the strongest biological structures behind. Savathûn, Orush, and Shiro felt the heat of the worms' bodies radiating through the viewport glass, warming their pale skin and drying the damp fabric of their clothing. The fossil in Savathûn's hand vibrated in perfect unison with the five massive beings outside, its calcified segments heating up against her palm. Yule opened his maw wider, and millions of tiny, squirming shapes poured from his throat, spilling out like a waterfall of wet flesh. They were larvae, pale and segmented, thrashing in the black fluid pooling on the carbon floor. Their bodies were translucent, revealing dark, pulsing internal organs, and their mouths snapped open and closed with tiny rows of sharp teeth. The vibrations from the worms formed a direct offer in the sisters' minds. The worms commanded the sisters to open the airlock, pick up the larvae, and ingest them. In exchange, the larvae would secrete a biological substance into the sisters' bloodstream, altering their cellular structure, thickening their soft chitin into hardened armor, and expanding their short lifespans into millions of years. The sisters would grow tall, wield immense physical strength, and possess the ability to reshape reality through the physical application of the blade. The offer contained a physical condition, transmitted as a sudden, sharp pain in the sisters' abdomens. The worms projected the sensation of gnawing, hollow hunger directly into their guts. The larvae required constant sustenance to survive inside a host. The sisters would need to feed their internal parasites continuously by conquering, killing, and consuming other life forms. The more they killed, the larger the worms would grow inside them, granting them even greater strength. Should the sisters halt their conquests, or should they starve the worms of physical violence and bloodshed, the larvae would turn their hooked teeth inward, consuming the sisters' organs and flesh from the inside out. The hunger would grow exactly in proportion to their strength, forcing an eternal campaign of slaughter across the stars to keep the parasites satiated. The 5 worm gods waited, their massive segmented bodies shifting over the crushed carbon rock, the heavy scraping sounds echoing against the needle ship's hull. Orash kept her hands tight on the brass levers, the metal slick with her sweat, and Shiro gripped her metal cleaver, watching the writhing sea of translucent larvae flopping in the mud outside the glass. Savathûn stepped forward, pressing her hands flat against the hot viewport, and she looked down at the tiny, thrashing creatures, preparing to step toward the ship's heavy iron airlock and take the writhing offspring into her own flesh. Savathûn wrapped her pale, long fingers around the heavy iron wheel of the needle ship's primary airlock. She turned the wheel hand over hand, and the thick metal locking pins retracted with a loud scrape against the hull. The heavy iron door swung outward, striking the exterior frame. The thick, hot atmosphere of the cavern rushed into the small cabin, carrying a heavy cloud of sulfur and metallic dust. Puddles of dark fluid spilled over the threshold from the cavern floor, carrying dozens of the pale, translucent larvae onto the metal grates of the ship. The tiny creatures thrashed, snapping their hooked teeth against the iron grating and leaving deep scratches in the metal. Savathûn knelt on the wet floor. She reached into the puddle and picked up one of the writhing larvae. The creature was cold and slick, its internal organs pulsing visibly beneath its segmented skin. Clear mucus dripped from its mouth onto her wrist. Savathûn brought the larva to her mouth and swallowed it whole. The creature slid down her throat and lodged deep within her abdomen. Immediately, her physical structure began to change. Her soft krill kitten cracked open along her spine, peeling away as a new, hardened shell formed underneath. The new armor grew deep, dark brown. Her spine lengthened, pushing her taller, and her limbs grew thicker, stretching her muscles tight. A heavy crest formed at the crown of her head, the bone pressing outward through her skin. Savathûn took the mother morph, a biological path reserved for spawning massive broods. Along with her altered flesh, she took a new name, calling herself Savathûn. Shiro watched the transformation from the center of the cabin. She dropped her metal cleaver onto the floor grates and plunged both hands into the dark fluid. She scooped up a large, aggressively thrashing larva and forced it down her throat. Her transformation was violent. Her bones cracked loudly, expanding and thickening beneath her skin. She tore through her original shell, scattering pieces of pale chitin across the room. Massive, spiked plates of heavy armor erupted from her shoulders and forearms. Her jaw widened, splitting at the hinges and reforming with dense muscle. Her 3 eyes burned with a bright, green luminescence. She grew massive, towering over the control consoles of the ship, taking the night morph. Shiro took the new name Shivu Arath, and she picked up her cleaver, her large hands wrapping completely around the grip. Orash remained by the brass steering levers. She looked at the larvae sliding across the floor. She knelt, took one of the segmented parasites, and consumed it. Her body stretched upward, breaking out of her pale shell. She grew taller and leaner than Shivu Arath, clad in dense, interlocking plates of dark armor that shifted smoothly over her joints. A wide, sweeping crown of heavy bone grew from her skull, fusing with her brow. Arash took the king morph, claiming the physical attributes of a ruler, and she stood up under the new name Oryx. The 3 sisters kicked away their molted shells, leaving the wet, hollow husks piled on the floor of the needle ship. They stood as massive, armored beings. They were the first of the hive, Their bodies radiated intense heat, drying the damp air of the cabin and causing the spilled fluid on the floor to evaporate into thin smoke. The physical strength in their limbs allowed Savathûn to crush the iron handholds of the ship just by gripping them. Inside their abdomens, the parasitic larvae secreted fluids directly into their bloodstreams. The chemicals accelerated their cellular regeneration, knitting over the tears in their skin left by the rapid bone growth within seconds. The biological symbiosis extended their lifespans indefinitely, sustaining their bodies with endless cellular renewal. They stood in the dim light of the cabin, their new lungs pulling in deep draughts of the thick cavern air, and their green eyes illuminating the dark corners of the room. The biological pact required immediate maintenance. As the fluids pumped through their veins, a sharp, physical burning ignited in their guts. The larvae gnawed at their stomach linings, demanding sustenance. The hunger manifested as a severe cramp, bending Savathûn over and causing Oryx to grip the edge of the control console. Savathûn pressed her hand against her abdomen. She felt the thick, muscular body of the worm shifting beneath her armor plates. The worms demanded the physical consumption of life to fuel the immense power they provided. Savathûn turned to Oryx and pointed toward the brass steering levers. The needle ship needed to ascend. They had to return to the surface of Fundament. The mother jelly, the osmium court, and their former tutor Teox waited above. The sisters required a massive amount of biological matter to feed their new parasites, and the armies of the helium drinkers offered the perfect physical fuel. Oryx gripped the levers and pulled them backward. The needle ship's engines ignited, blasting a crater into the carbon rock, and Oryx angled the sharp nose of the vessel upward, tearing through the thick atmosphere and carving a path straight back toward the upper oceans, where the sisters would unleash their new physical forms upon their enemies. The needle ship breached the churning surface of Fundament, tearing through the thick methane rain. Oryx, Savathûn, and Savathûn stepped out onto the floating carbon continents, their new armored bodies towering over the krill. They carried massive blades forged from the ship's hull and marched directly toward the helium court. The helium drinkers raised their serrated swords, and the three sisters swung their heavy weapons. Blades shattered armor plates, severing limbs and spilling thick, dark fluid across the stone. With every krill that fell, the parasitic larvae inside the sisters' abdomens secreted a chemical heat into their blood. The sisters physically grew. Their chitin expanded and hardened, and their muscles thickened with every kill. They carved their path through the continent, leaving piles of severed chitin and crushed bone in their wake. The sisters translated this biological reaction into a written law, carving the runes of the sword logic into the jagged cliffs of their home world. The runes provided instructions for a physical process. To strike down a living creature proved the striker possessed superior biological and physical strength. The slain creature provided physical fuel for the worm, and the worm provided calcium and muscle mass to the host. Savathûn directed her newly mutated spawn, now called the Hive, to practice this process daily. Hive warriors drove cleavers into the chests of their weaker broodmates, absorbing the dead matter to fuel their own molting cycles. The constant severing of flesh generated a steady supply of wet, clicking larvae, which Savathûn scooped into the mouths of the krill, converting the entire population of the floating continents into armored killers. The three sisters marched through the burning remains of the osmium court, searching the stone corridors for their former tutor, Teox. They found empty chambers and discarded robes. Teox had boarded a metal shuttle and launched herself upward, fleeing toward the 52 moons orbiting Fundament. The moons housed the Ammonites, a species of six-armed cephalopods who built cities of spun ice and glass along the frozen craters of the satellites. The Ammonites possessed advanced laser weaponry and shielding technology provided by the Traveler, the massive white sphere floating in their sky. Oryx commanded the hive to hollow out the floating continents of Fundament. The hive bored deep tunnels through the rock, filling the chambers with explosive propulsion chemicals. They launched the massive rock fragments into the sky, riding the hollowed-out meteors directly into the Ammonite moons. The rock ships crashed through the glass domes of the Ammonite cities, sending shards of ice and metal spiraling into orbit. Hive knights poured from the craters, swinging heavy cleavers into the soft, tentacled bodies of the Ammonite defenders. Green fire spread across the lunar ice, melting the cities into pools of boiling water. During the slaughter, Savathûn directed her broods away from the front lines. She instructed her acolytes to dig narrow trenches beneath the Ammonite defense grids. She mixed the acidic fluids from Fundament's core with the crushed bones of her enemies, creating a highly corrosive toxin. Her broods pumped this green liquid into the Ammonite water supply, dissolving the internal organs of the defenders before the hive knights breached the walls. Savathûn stood on a ridge of shattered ice, watching the Ammonite soldiers collapse, coughing up green fluid. She pressed the fossilized worm against her jawbone, and the voice of the worm gods vibrated through her skull. The worms praised the physical folds of her brain and the sharp, lateral connections of her nerves. They instructed her to continue breeding her larvae to create massive swarms of clawed thralls, recognizing that her physical traps and engineered toxins yielded a higher harvest of dead matter than a simple blade. The Ammonite defense lines collapsed under the heavy physical assault. The six-armed bodies of their leaders floated in the zero-gravity orbit above their ruined moons, their blood crystallizing in the vacuum of space. The massive white sphere, the Traveler, shifted its orbit and moved away into the deep black of the cosmos, leaving the shattered moons behind. Amidst the falling ash and floating debris, Teox secured herself inside a cryogenic pod on a small cargo vessel. The ship's thrusters ignited, pushing it out of the Fundament system and pointing its nose toward a distant star cluster known as the Hydrogen Fountain. Savathûn, Oryx, and Savathûn Arath stood together on the scorched lunar surface, their massive armored boots crushing the frozen remains of the Ammonite cities. The heat from their bodies melted the ice around their feet. Inside their abdomens, the parasitic worms gnawed aggressively at their stomach linings. The slaughter of the entire Ammonite species provided just enough chemical fuel to satiate the larvae temporarily. The worms demanded more matter, more bone to crush, and more fluid to consume. The physical bodies of the sisters required continuous slaughter to satisfy the parasite's endless demand for flesh. The physical space of the material universe offered a finite number of battlefields. The three hive gods looked beyond the physical stars, raising their massive blades to cut a path directly into the underlying fabric of reality itself, to build slaughterhouses that would last for eternity. Oryx gripped the long handle of his massive cleaver and swung the heavy blade through the empty vacuum of space. The sharp metal edge sliced through the physical fabric of the universe, tearing open a jagged, glowing hole. Green light spilled from the tear, illuminating the dust and debris floating around the hive gods. Oryx, Savathûn, and Savathûn Arath stepped through the glowing opening and entered a dimension filled with dark, shifting matter. This space was the Ascendant Plane. The three siblings ordered their broods to carry the crushed bones, the harvested chitin, and the drained flesh of their conquered enemies through the dimensional tiers. They packed the dead biological matter tightly together, molding the raw materials into solid landmasses and towering structures. Oryx built a jagged fortress of calcified rock. Savathûn forged a massive arena with high iron walls. Savathûn constructed a sprawling network of damp, twisting tunnels lined with the preserved husks of the creatures she had dissected. They called these constructed spaces throne worlds. The throne worlds functioned as physical extensions of their accumulated biomass, providing a secure space where their bodies could regenerate bone and tissue after suffering fatal wounds in the material universe. After completing their fortresses in the ascendant plane, the hive fleets flew toward the territory of a species known as the Chugu. The Chugu piloted massive fleshy ships that pulsed with thick veins, and they communicated by feeding jaw beasts attached directly to their own bodies. Hive knights boarded the fleshy vessels, driving their heavy cleavers into the soft, muscular bulkheads and spilling thick red fluids onto the floor grates. Savathûn captured several of the Chugu jaw beasts and brought them into her ships. She pinned the writhing creatures to her stone dissection tables, peeling back their thick skin to expose their internal organs. She extracted the biological viruses the Chugu naturally produced in their glands and mixed the fluids with acidic compounds from fundament. She injected the modified viruses back into the jaw beasts and released the infected creatures into the Chugu population. The modified virus caused the Chugu to rot from the inside out, turning their internal organs into liquid prior to the arrival of the hive warriors. After butchering the remaining Chugu and absorbing their biomass, the three siblings turned their heavy weapons on each other. They slashed at each other with broadswords and drove iron spikes through each other's armor to feed their internal parasites and measure the thickness of their new chitin plates. Oryx swung his heavy sword and severed Savathûn's head from her shoulders, sending her body crashing to the carbon floor. Savathûn swung a massive iron mace and crushed Oryx's chest cavity, splintering his ribs into his lungs. Savathûn drove a poisoned bone spike deep into Savathûn's neck, pumping corrosive acid into her nervous system. Each time one of them suffered a fatal physical blow, their consciousness retreated instantly to their respective throne worlds in the ascendant plane. Inside those dark spaces, their biological matter knitted back together, forming new bones, fresh muscle tissue, and thicker chitin. They stepped back through the dimensional tiers, returning to the physical universe to resume the slaughter of their siblings. Oryx designated a wide, flat plateau of calcified rock within his throne world and named it the Court of Oryx. He ordered his knights and acolytes to gather on the stone surface and engage in physical combat. The victors carved the parasites from the abdomens of the defeated and consumed them, growing physically larger and developing denser armor plates. Savathûn stood at the edge of the plateau and observed her brother's court, noting the direct, blunt application of physical force. She returned to her own sprawling tunnels and established the High Coven. She gathered the surviving members of her mother morph, identifying them as wizards. She instructed them to stand over pools of boiling acid and volatile chemicals. The wizards mixed toxic fluids, extracted marrow from captured enemies, and engineered new biological weapons. They tested these chemical creations on captured thralls, watching the weak flesh dissolve and mutate into new biological shapes. The hive fleets continued flying across the stars, leaving trails of shattered planets and floating debris in their wake. They approached a star system surrounded by a massive accretion disk of dust and gas, the homeworld of a civilization known as the Harmony. Savathûn stood on the bridge of her flagship, watching the distant stars through the thick glass viewport. She pressed her long fingers against her jawbone and evaluated her brother's growing physical size. She issued commands to her navigators, instructing them to adjust the trajectory of her fleet. She pointed her hollowed-out war moons toward the crushing gravity of the black hole at the center of the Harmony's system, preparing to put vast physical distance between her chemical experiments and the sweeping blades of her siblings. The Hive fleets breached the Harmony star system, and the Harmony-piloted silver sting ships fueled by the intense radiation of the massive black hole. Savathûn Arath's heavy war moons crashed directly into the silver ships, crumpling their hulls and spilling their frozen crews into the vacuum of space, while Oryx drove his heavy cleaver into the command centers of the Harmony defense grids, severing the thick power cables. Savathûn directed her broods to the edges of the conflict, and she ordered her wizards to release engineered spores into the ventilation shafts of the Harmony orbital stations. The spores germinated rapidly in the warm lungs of the defenders, expanding and suffocating them before Savathûn Arath's forces even breached the outer bulkheads. With the Harmony defenders reduced to floating organic matter, Savathûn stood on the observation deck of her flagship, looking at the black hole, a massive sphere of absolute darkness surrounded by a spinning disk of superheated gas. She pulled the brass levers on her command console, firing the main thrusters of her war moons, and the massive hollowed-out rocks altered their trajectories, turning away from the fleets of her siblings. The moons accelerated toward the black hole, crossing the threshold where the intense gravitational pull bent the light around them. The crushing gravity warped the stone and metal of her ships, compressing the outer hulls, and as her physical fleet vanished into the dark sphere, her throne world in the ascendant plane shifted. The calcified rock and damp tunnels of her high coven pulled away from the fortresses of Oryx and Savathûn Arath, stretching the dimensional tiers, connecting them until the pathways snapped and severed completely, leaving her realm adrift in the dark matter. Savathûn isolated herself and her broods in the deep orbit of the anomaly. Savathûn Arath swung her massive mace on open battlefields, and Oryx matched blades with alien commanders, while Savathûn remained sitting in the shadows of her quiet laboratories. She stood over wide dissection tables, carving open the skulls of captured creatures to map their neural pathways, and she examined the physical structure of their optical nerves and vocal cords, documenting exactly how they processed light and sound. She used this data to construct visual traps, building arrays of light-bending crystals on the hulls of her ships, projecting massive images of hive fleets into empty space. When rival species fired their heavy munitions at these empty projections, they depleted their arsenals and left their planetary defenses exposed. Savathûn recorded these miscalculations. When an enemy fleet diverted its course to chase a phantom signal, the parasitic larva in her abdomen writhed and secreted thick, hot fluids into her bloodstream. Her dark chitin plates expanded, and her muscles gained mass, so she grew physically larger and stronger through the misdirection of her foes. The physical act of deceiving another living creature provided the same biological fuel as driving a blade through a chest cavity, and she weaponized this biological reaction. She instructed her acolytes to carve contradictory runes into the stone pillars of conquered worlds, and she ordered her wizards to broadcast vocal frequencies that mimicked the distress signals of other species, drawing targeted rescue ships directly into fields of corrosive space mines. The survivors of these traps spread warnings across the interstellar communication channels, referring to Savathûn by multiple designations. They carved her descriptions into metal warning buoys, identifying her as the Witch Queen, the god of cunning, and the queen of lies. Savathûn intercepted these broadcasts and played the audio recordings in her chambers, and she observed the fear vibrating through the vocal patterns of the speakers. Every time a new species misunderstood her physical location or the chemical makeup of her biological weapons, the worm in her gut consumed the generated ignorance as physical matter, pumping endless streams of regenerative chemicals through her massive body, solidifying her dark armor and sharpening her claws, proving her theories through the physical expansion of her own frame. Savathûn directed her fleets deeper into the uncharted sectors of the physical universe, dissecting the gravitational waves of dying stars and extracting dense fluids from collapsing nebulas. She measured the exact volume of biological matter her broods consumed daily and compared it to the rapid growth rate of the larvae inside their abdomens, and she calculated the biological trajectory of her species using long rows of brass abacuses and sweeping chalk diagrams on the cold stone walls of her flagship. The numbers indicated a clear physical limit, mapping a terminal endpoint for the krill. The worms grew faster than the hive could harvest flesh across the stars, and the hungry parasites would eventually turn their teeth inward to consume their hosts. Savathûn stared at the chalk calculations, tracing the lines of data that proved the eternal pact was biologically unsustainable, and she turned her green eyes toward the dense armor of her brother Oryx, preparing to share the physical evidence of their impending starvation. The vast hive fleets engaged the forces of the ecumene. The ecumene operated as a massive coalition of varied species, utilizing heavily armed war spheres and targeted plasma grids. They deployed cybernetic soldiers across the battlefields, directing concentrated beams of superheated plasma at the hive war moons. The plasma melted the rocky crusts and incinerated the broods waiting in the launch bays, leaving massive craters of glowing slag on the lunar surfaces. Oryx stood on the bridge of his dreadnought, watching his knights turn into floating clouds of ash. He pressed his heavy gauntlet against his abdomen. The parasite inside him thrashed, driving its sharp teeth through his stomach lining and pulling on his internal organs. Oryx fed the worm, the biomass of millions of ecumene soldiers, yet the parasite expanded its girth and demanded more sustenance. The biological mass required to satiate the parasite increased directly with every conquered world. Oryx looked at the chalk mathematical projections carved into his stone war tables. The calculations showed a clear, physical intersection point, where the worm's consumption rate would surpass the hive's killing capacity. The worm gods had structured the biological pact to ensure the parasites would eventually consume their hosts. Savathûn steered her flagship alongside Oryx's dreadnought, aligning the massive airlocks of the two vessels. The metal clamps locked together with a heavy metallic thud, sealing the vacuum of space. She walked through the pressurized docking tubes and entered his command chamber. She carried physical cross-sections of infected krill anatomy, bringing the heavy stone slabs into the room and slamming them onto Oryx's command table. She pointed her long, sharp claws at the deep bite marks along the spinal columns of the preserved specimens, highlighting the physical damage the worms inflicted on the surrounding tissue. Savathûn spoke to her brother, her voice echoing off the calcified walls and vibrating the heavy brass instruments on the desk. She demanded physical proof of the final shape, the ultimate biological endpoint promised by the worm gods. She gestured to the burning war moons outside the viewport, presenting the immediate destruction of their broods as the only observable reality of their campaign. The deep offered them a physical law of constant reduction, leading to a single surviving organism. Savathûn dragged her claws through the chalk diagrams on the table, smearing the calculations into grey dust. She stated, the universe held endless physical spaces and constantly expanding galaxies, making a single endpoint a mathematical contradiction. Savathûn left Oryx's command chamber and returned to her own fleet, descending into the deepest laboratories of her flagship. She ordered her wizards to bring live worm larvae from the spawning pools and pin them to the heavy stone dissection tables with iron spikes. The larvae writhed and snapped their jaws, scratching the stone surface. Savathûn drove sharp scalpels into their segmented bodies, draining their volatile, dark fluids into glass vials. She mapped the exact chemical receptors the worms used to process the physical matter generated by the sword logic. She studied the thick nerve clusters connecting the parasites to the central hive nervous system, tracing the pathways the worms use to transmit pain and hunger directly to the brain. She tasked her broods with gathering alternative biological fuel sources from the ecumene war zones. She sought a chemical substitute for the flesh harvested on the battlefield, aiming to feed the worms through complex chemical synthesis and raw neurological energy gathered from deception. Savathûn altered the architecture of her high coven, commanding her acolytes to build massive containment vaults designed to hold biological specimens in stasis. She drafted blueprints to isolate the hive from the parasites, planning to sever the physical tether that bound their life cycles together. Her acolytes carved new runes into the thick iron walls of the vaults, designing traps meant to extract the life force of captured entities slowly over centuries. Savathûn watched the glowing fluids drip through the glass tubes of her laboratories, cataloguing the chemical reactions and preparing for a future detached from the constant swinging of heavy blades. She mapped a long-term biological trajectory, aiming to evolve her species and secure a permanent food source derived from the measured misunderstandings of her enemies. While Savathûn focused her tools on the anatomy of the worms, the war against the ecumene continued to reduce the physical numbers of the hive populations. The ecumene plasma grids burned through Oryx's defensive lines, pushing his fleets back into the cold edges of the star system. The ecumene war spheres advanced in geometric formations, projecting fields of crushing gravity that fractured the hulls of the hive ships. The hunger in Oryx's gut forced him to his knees, his massive armor plates grinding against the stone floor of his flagship. The physical pain radiated through his spine, tearing at his muscles and demanding an immediate infusion of massive biological energy. Oryx rose to his feet and wrapped his thick fingers around the hilt of his heavy cleaver. He turned his glowing green eyes away from the advancing ecumene war spheres and locked his gaze directly on the armored bodies of Savathûn and Xivu Arath. Oryx carved his new title into the hull of his dreadnought, a colossal vessel constructed from the severed physical segments of the worm god Akka. He sliced the dark bone into a massive cylinder, lining the interior with damp, fleshy corridors and deep spawning pits filled with squirming larvae. He piloted this massive structure using a central navigation console forged from compressed carbon. Furthermore, his spawn, Crota, stood on the dusty grey surface of the Earth's moon. Crota measured 50 feet tall, his body covered in jagged, pale armor plates that emitted a toxic green luminescence. He swung a cleaver the size of a dropship, cracking the lunar bedrock and crushing the woven titanium suits of the light-bearers. Consequently, a small fire team of these light-bearers descended into the subterranean pits of the moon. They stripped the glowing bone swords from the hands of the hive knights and drove the heavy weapons directly into Crota's chest. The green fire in Crota's optical nerves extinguished, and his exoskeleton crumbled into a pile of grey ash on the stone floor. The biological vibration running through Oryx's nervous system ceased instantly. Oryx gripped the brass steering levers of his dreadnought and pushed the vessel into the Sol system. The massive bone ship collided with the rings of Saturn, displacing millions of tons of frozen water and rock, leaving a perfectly circular void in the planetary ring. Subsequently, the light-bearers launched small, angular metal jump ships toward the dreadnought. They drove their vessels through the exterior energy shields and crashed directly into the calcified hull. They stepped out into the damp corridors, firing streams of superheated solar plasma and high-velocity tungsten slugs into the hive defenders. They marched onto the flat stone surface of the court of Oryx. Oryx swung his colossal blade, slamming the heavy iron into the floor grates and sending shockwaves through the stone. The light-bearers jumped over the shifting stone plates and fired their weapons directly into the joints of Oryx's armor. Oryx pulled his physical mass into the ascendant plane, retreating to the center of his throne world. The light-bearers stepped through the glowing green tiers in the fabric of space. Oryx grew to the size of a skyscraper in this dimension, his heavy wings stretching across the dark, cloudy sky of his inner sanctum. He summoned meteors of dark matter, crashing them into the stone plateau. The light-bearers ran across the shaking platforms. They gathered caches of volatile, corrupted light, spherical masses of dense thermal energy left on the stone plates. They detonated these caches simultaneously, directing the explosive blasts directly at Oryx's chest cavity. The intense heat melted his thick chitin and ruptured his internal organs. His heavy chest plates cracked apart. His massive, calcified corpse drifted backward, falling off the edge of the stone plateau. He floated silently out into the vacuum of space, tumbling slowly among the ice chunks of Saturn's rings. Millions of light-years away, Savathûn stood over a stone dissection table in her laboratory. The room contained rows of glass jars filled with floating krill organs, bubbling acidic compounds, and the dissected husks of kugu jaw beasts. She held a glass vial filled with dark worm fluid. The biological vibration connecting her to her brother stopped. She placed the vial onto the slate surface and walked to the thick glass viewport of her flagship. She fixed her green eyes on the distant light of the Sol system. Oryx possessed the largest physical frame and swung the heaviest blade in the universe. The light-bearers possessed small biological frames and carried small metal firearms. The small tungsten projectiles shattered the dense bone armor of the Hive King. Savathûn dragged her long, sharp claws across the slate of her command desk, carving deep grooves into the rock and sending stone dust falling to the floor grates. The physical destruction of her brother provided the final data point for her chalk diagrams. The lines on her slate displayed a physical intersection point. The thick bone fractured under the concentrated thermal blasts. Her internal parasite twisted violently in her abdomen, biting at her stomach lining and demanding the massive volume of biological matter her brother previously harvested. Savathûn turned her back to the viewport and issued new vocal commands to her brood. She instructed her wizards to anchor all forward assault vessels and to drape thick, light-bending shrouds over the war moons. She ordered her acolytes to synthesize new biological skins, preparing to infiltrate the territory of the light-bearers by shedding her massive chitin plates and adopting the exact physical dimensions of her enemies. The human warlock Osiris walked through the subterranean tunnels of the Earth's moon. He held a steel kinetic rifle, pressing the heavy stock against his shoulder. He stepped over the calcified bones of dead hive acolytes and crushed the green, glowing crystals under his thick leather boots. The air in the cavern smelled of sulfur and wet ash. A massive hive knight, the high celebrant of Sivu Arath, stood at the end of the corridor. The knight gripped a jagged iron cleaver and charged forward, its heavy armored boots fracturing the stone floor grates with every step. Osiris pulled the trigger of his rifle, sending streams of tungsten slugs directly into the knight's chest plates. The thick chitin deflected the projectiles, sending bright orange sparks cascading into the damp air. The knight swung its heavy cleaver, striking Osiris in the ribcage. The iron blade shattered Osiris's ceramic armor, fracturing his ribs and sending him crashing onto the rocky ground. A small, diamond-shaped mechanical construct called Sagira hovered above Osiris's bleeding chest. Sagira consisted of a central glass core surrounded by articulated metal shell pieces. She spun her shell pieces rapidly, drawing in massive quantities of ambient thermal light from the surrounding atmosphere. The glass core glowed blinding white, emitting intense heat that melted the frost on the cavern walls and scorched the loose dirt. Sagira detonated her core, releasing a concentrated shockwave of superheated solar energy. The blast incinerated the advancing hive warriors, turning their dense chitin armor into grey ash and leaving a wide crater of bubbling molten rock in the center of the tunnel. Osiris lay on his back, his chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. The falling ash settled over his torn woven robes. Savathûn stepped out from the deep shadows of the lunar pillars. She extended her long, clawed fingers and secreted a thick, black biological resin from her glands. She wrapped Osiris in the hardening resin, forming a dense cocoon around his limp body, sealing him entirely within the dark matter. Savathûn then began her biological synthesis. She commanded her cellular structure to break down her massive chitin plates. The heavy bone armor dissolved into pools of dark fluid on the stone floor. She compressed her muscle mass and shortened her spine, altering her physical dimensions to match the exact height and build of the human warlock. She synthesized a layer of pale, wrinkled skin over her newly arranged skeleton. She picked up Osiris's torn fabric robes and strapped his remaining ceramic armor plates over her shoulders. She adjusted the cartilage in her throat, tightening the vocal cords to replicate the exact acoustic frequencies of the old man's voice. She walked back to the lunar surface and boarded Osiris's angular metal jump ship. She pulled the control levers, igniting the plasma thrusters and propelling the vessel through the vacuum of space toward the Earth. The ship descended through the white clouds and landed on the flat concrete pads of the last city. Savathûn stepped out of the cockpit. She smelled the heavy exhaust of the ships and the ozone from the electrical generators. She walked through the crowded plazas, her boots stepping on the paved stone. Humans in thick woven jackets and metal worker suits walked past her, carrying wooden crates of machine parts and bundles of hydroponic crops. She maintained the physical posture of the weary warlock, dragging her feet slightly and keeping her chin lowered toward her chest. She entered the Vanguard Command Tower, a towering structure built from reinforced steel and thick glass viewports. In the central operations room, two figures stood over a glowing blue hollow table, displaying orbital trajectories. Zavala, a tall awoken man with blue skin and heavy white ceramic shoulder armor, rested his large hands on the metal rim of the table. Ikora Ray, a human female, wearing purple woven robes, swiped her fingers across the floating light projections. Savathûn stepped up to the table, utilizing Osiris's vocal cords to speak. She provided precise tactical data regarding the movement of Xivu Arath's war moons, detailing the exact physical coordinates of the hive spawning pits. Zavala and Ikora listened to the acoustic frequencies, processing the tactical information. They issued commands through their communication radios, redirecting fleets of armed jump ships based entirely on Savathûn's provided coordinates. Deep within Savathûn's human-shaped abdomen, her parasitic worm writhed. The physical act of deceiving the light-bearers generated a massive chemical reaction. The worm consumed the physical energy generated by their acceptance of the false coordinates, secreting thick, regenerative fluids directly into her bloodstream. The chemical infusion strengthened her muscles and repaired her cellular damage, sustaining her biological life through pure deception. Savathûn walked to the wide glass viewport of the command room and looked out over the concrete buildings of the last city. High above the steel towers, the sky shifted. A massive network of glowing purple geometric shapes materialized in the atmosphere. This structure was a Vex simulation grid, a physical manifestation of computational data slowly lowering itself over the human population. The grid cast deep purple shadows across the concrete plazas below. Savathûn watched the glowing cubes descend, preparing to manipulate the physical light and drain the electrical energy from the city's power grids. The purple geometric cubes of the Vex network projected downward, casting heavy shadows across the last city. The grid blocked the solar rays, causing thick frost to form on the concrete sidewalks and the edges of the metal water towers. Savathûn walked through the dim plazas, her synthesized leather boots clicking against the paving stones. She observed the human citizens pulling thick wool coats over their shoulders and carrying iron lanterns to illuminate the dark alleyways. She navigated toward the faction headquarters, entering a steel-walled chamber smelling of burning ozone and heated copper wire. A human exo named Lakshmi II stood before a metal broadcasting console. Lakshmi II possessed a chassis of white ceramic and glowing blue optical sensors. Savathûn placed a stack of encrypted glass data drives onto the metal desk. She used Osiris's vocal cords to speak, feeding Lakshmi II precise acoustic frequencies containing altered tactical data regarding the Elixni refugees living in the city ruins. Lakshmi II plugged the glass drives into her console and broadcasted the altered data through the city's radio towers, prompting human residents to throw glass bottles and iron pipes at the four-armed Elixni in the lower districts. Deep within the ascendant plane, a massive Vex Hydra named Kuria maintained the physical structure of the purple grid. Kuria consisted of rotating brass chassis rings and thick hydraulic tentacles, and its entire exterior dripped with volatile, black taken fluid. Savathûn had previously captured Kuria and altered its central processing core, binding the machine's computational output to her own biological nervous system. Kuria injected long metal spikes into the glowing white data streams of the Vex network, pulling thermal energy away from the Earth and storing the stolen heat within dense geometric batteries in the ascendant realm. The black fluid on Kuria's chassis boiled as it processed the massive intake of solar radiation. The worm inside Savathûn's abdomen reacted to the city-wide deception, gnawing on the lining of her synthesized stomach and demanding a continuous flow of the extracted energy. The Guardians loaded their kinetic rifles and boarded their angular metal jump ships. They ignited their plasma thrusters and flew directly into the glowing white portals hovering above the last city. The ships passed through the dimensional thresholds, landing on the floating crystalline platforms of the Vex network. The Guardians stepped out, and their heavy boots cracked the delicate crystal floor. They ran across the geometric bridges, firing superheated solar plasma into the brass frames of defending Vex Minotaurs. The plasma melted the metal plating and ignited the radiolarian fluid contained within the Vex chassis, leaving pools of glowing white liquid burning on the platforms. The fire teams moved forward methodically, tracking the thick black cables Kuria used to siphon the solar energy. The Guardians reached the central computational core, a massive circular arena composed of shifting glass tiles. Curia floated in the center, rotating its heavy brass rings and firing concentrated blasts of void energy from its optical cannons. The purple blasts struck the Guardian's ceramic armor, melting the outer layers and sending them sliding backward across the glass. The Guardians spread out around the perimeter. They unslung heavy rocket launchers from their shoulders and fired clustered volleys of explosive munitions directly at the joints of Curia's hydraulic tentacles. The warheads detonated against the brass armor, tearing the metal rings apart and severing the thick internal cables. Dark taken fluid spilled from the ruptured metal plates, splashing onto the glass tiles and dissolving the computational circuits underneath. Curia's central optical sensor cracked, releasing a blinding flash of white light before shattering into thousands of glass fragments. The massive Hydra collapsed onto the floor, and its chassis broke apart into smoking pieces of twisted brass. With Curia's processor destroyed, the physical tether holding the purple geometric grid over the last city snapped. The glowing cubes in the Earth's atmosphere dissolved into gray dust, and direct sunlight hit the concrete streets once again. The frost on the water towers melted, dripping down the rusted iron legs and splashing onto the pavement below. Inside the Vanguard command tower, Savathûn watched the sunlight illuminate the metal floorboards. She catalogued the destruction of Curia and the immediate loss of the stolen thermal energy. Her internal parasite twisted violently, reacting to the sudden drop in biological fuel. Simultaneously, the Guardians recovered encrypted data drives from the shattered remains of Curia. The drives contained exact physical records of Savathûn's commands, matching the acoustic frequencies she used while wearing Osiris's skin. Zavala and Ikora Ray inserted the drives into their holotable, and the blue projections displayed the biological signature of the Hive Witch Queen overlaid with Osiris's physical dimensions. The awoken and human commanders unholstered their sidearms, aiming the iron barrels toward the old warlock. Savathûn turned away from the glass viewport. She raised her hands and channeled the remaining thermal light stolen by Curia, generating a blinding flash of solar energy in the center of the command room. The intense heat forced Zavala and Ikora to shield their faces with their armored gauntlets. Savathûn stepped backward into the blinding light, utilizing a pre-calculated dimensional tear to transport her physical mass out of the tower. She materialized inside the cockpit of a hidden dropship waiting in the upper atmosphere. She gripped the heavy control yokes and pushed the thrusters to maximum output, flying away from the Earth and setting a direct trajectory toward the reef, a chaotic cluster of hollowed-out asteroids and shattered colony ships floating at the edge of the system. The dropship navigated through the dense asteroid fields, scraping its hull against the floating metal debris. Savathûn steered the vessel toward the dreaming city, a hidden sanctuary built by the Awoken on a massive, flat disk of purple quartz. The ship touched down on a landing pad constructed from polished silver. Savathûn stepped out of the cockpit, still wearing the wrinkled skin and torn robes of Osiris. She walked across the silver bridge, approaching a high throne carved from solid amethyst. Mara Sov, the Awoken Queen, sat on the throne, wearing a dress of woven blue fibers and holding a long rifle across her lap. Savathûn halted at the base of the steps, preparing to shed her human disguise and present a new physical bargain to the Awoken ruler. Savathûn, utilizing the physical frame and vocal cords of the warlock Osiris, presented her request to Mara Sov. She demanded physical refuge within the solid quartz walls of the dreaming city, offering to extract the heavy biological parasite from her own abdomen in exchange for protection from the weapons of her sister, Xivu Arath. Mara Sov agreed to the physical terms. The Awoken Queen directed her corsairs to encase Savathûn inside a massive block of translucent stasis crystal. The crystal arrested the chemical reactions within Savathûn's body, locking her false human flesh and the thrashing worm inside a state of absolute physical suspension. The corsairs transported the heavy block into a wide, open chamber built from polished amethyst and surrounded by thick iron braziers. The physical extraction required specific biological components. Savathûn, communicating through the resonance of the crystal, instructed the light-bearers to travel to the distant edges of the system and locate her lost coven of Techians, awoken witches who possessed the exact neural architecture required to sever the physical nerve clusters binding the parasite to her spine. The light-bearers boarded their ships and flew to the ascendant plane, tearing through the fleshy corridors of Xivu Arath's fortresses and extracting the captive Techians from iron cages. They brought the Techians back to the dreaming city, lining them up around the massive crystal block. While confined inside the stasis field, the worm inside Savathûn's gut starved. Without the constant influx of chemical energy generated by deception and slaughter, the parasite turned its hooked teeth inward, biting into the synthesized human stomach lining. The physical pain spiked through Savathûn's nervous system, but the stasis crystal prevented her body from reacting. She maintained her focus on the heavy iron braziers surrounding her prison, waiting for the Techians to begin the extraction. The awoken witches raised their hands and channeled concentrated streams of thermal energy into the crystal. The thick ice began to melt, dripping water onto the polished quartz floor. As the ice dissolved, Savathûn's physical form broke out of the human synthesis. The wrinkled skin split open, and the massive dark chitin plates of her true hive body expanded outward, cracking the remaining crystal fragments into dust. The Techians focused their thermal beams directly onto Savathûn's abdomen. The concentrated heat burned through her outer armor plates, exposing the thick, pulsating body of the parasitic worm. The witches used the thermal energy as a scalpel, carefully severing the dense nerve clusters connecting the worm to her spinal column. The physical tether snapped. The worm fell from her open chest cavity, hitting the quartz floor with a heavy, wet thud. It thrashed wildly, snapping its jaws and spilling black fluid onto the stone. The extraction was complete, but the sudden absence of the parasite created a massive biological void within Savathûn's body. The regenerative chemicals stopped flowing through her veins. Her cellular structure began to rapidly degrade. Her thick chitin plates turned brittle and gray, and her muscles lost their density. Without the worm, she was dying. Savathûn dragged her heavy boots across the quartz floor, stepping past the smoking braziers and the exhausted Techians. She raised her hands and channeled the last reserves of her internal energy, tearing a jagged opening in the fabric of space. She stepped through the dimensional tear, abandoning the human warlock Osiris on the floor of the chamber, and retreated to the empty, dusty plains of the Earth's moon. She walked across the grey lunar surface, her boots leaving shallow prints in the regolith. Her breathing grew ragged, and her vision blurred as her optical nerves began to fail. She collapsed onto her knees near the edge of a deep, rocky crater. She looked up at the massive white sphere of the traveler, hanging silently in the black sky above the Earth. For billions of years, she had relied on the physical consumption of flesh to fuel her biological existence. Now, the worm was gone, and her body was shutting down. She extended her hand toward the white sphere, her long claws trembling. A bright beam of pure white light pierced the black sky, striking Savathûn directly in the chest. The intense thermal energy burned away her decaying chitin and completely vaporized her physical body, leaving only a pile of white ash resting on the grey lunar dust. A moment later, a small, diamond-shaped mechanical construct materialized above the ash. It was a ghost, a physical conduit of the traveler's light. The ghost projected a cone of bright blue light downward, scanning the exact molecular composition of the ash. It spun its metal shell pieces and released a concentrated burst of biological reconstruction energy. The white ash swirled upward, rapidly forming into solid bone, thick muscle tissue, and a new, pristine white exoskeleton. Savathûn stood up on the lunar surface. She opened her 3 glowing green eyes and inhaled a deep breath of the thin atmosphere. She possessed a completely new physical body, untethered from the parasitic worm and fueled entirely by the constant, burning radiation of the traveler's light. She looked down at the mechanical ghost hovering by her shoulder, raised her hand, and pointed toward her throne world, preparing to completely alter the physical structure of her domain. Savathûn raised her right hand over the grey dust of the lunar surface. The traveler's light flowed through her newly formed veins, manifesting as physical heat in her palm. The light possessed completely different physical properties than the chemical energy extracted from the worm. It did not require the consumption of mass, nor did it gnaw at her internal organs. The light functioned as a dense, malleable radiation. She focused the heat, and a beam of concentrated solar energy shot from her hand, melting the lunar regolith into a smooth, glassy crater. She turned and faced her throne world. Her previous domain consisted of damp, rotting bone corridors and pools of acidic toxins, built over millions of years by processing the biomass of conquered species. That physical structure reflected the sword logic and the hunger of the parasite. The light inside her body provided a new architectural blueprint. Savathûn channeled the glowing white energy outward, projecting it directly into the ascendant plane. The radiation struck the calcified rock of her fortress, shattering the dark chitin walls and instantly vaporizing the stagnant pools of green fluid. She rebuilt her throne world using the physical application of the light. The grey bone fragments shifted and fused together under the intense thermal heat, transforming into smooth, white alabaster. The damp, narrow tunnels expanded into wide, soaring archways and open courtyards. She formed intricate stained glass windows along the high walls, letting the ambient energy of the ascendant realm filter through the colored panes. She manipulated the moisture in the air, creating calm, reflecting pools, and wide, deep lakes that mirrored the white architecture. The entire physical structure shifted from a place of biological decay into a brightly lit fortress of smooth stone and clear water. While she reshaped her domain, the mechanical ghost hovered nearby. The small, diamond-shaped construct rotated its metal shell, its blue optical sensor tracking her movements. Ghosts were the physical vessels that carried the traveler's light, and they typically bonded with human corpses, resurrecting them as light-bearers. Savathûn walked over to the hovering machine. She wrapped her long, pale fingers around its metal shell, holding it steady in the air. The ghost did not resist. She closely examined its glass core, observing the physical flow of the white energy pulsing inside. She needed to distribute this energy to her remaining brood. Her hive acolytes and knights still carried the hungry larvae inside their abdomens, and their bodies were still rotting under the demands of the sword logic. Savathûn opened a dimensional tier and summoned a vanguard jump ship she had stolen during her time in the last city. The ship carried a cargo hold full of dead, unbonded ghosts she had collected from the battlefields. She brought the metal shells into her new white courtyards. Savathûn gathered her most loyal hive wizards and knights. She directed the wizards to extract the writhing larvae from the knights' abdomens using sharp bone scalpels. The knights collapsed onto the alabaster floor, their bodies shivering and shutting down as the biological tether snapped. Savathûn stood over the dying warriors. She raised the dead, unbonded ghosts and channeled her own light into their glass cores. The metal shells sparked, and the blue optical sensors flickered to life. She released the ghosts, and they hovered down toward the dying hive knights. The resurrected ghosts projected cones of bright blue light over the hive bodies. The radiation fused the cracked chitin, repaired the torn internal organs, and reignited their nervous systems. The knights stood back up. Their dark, jagged armor plates turned smooth and white, matching the alabaster stone of the throne world. Their green, three-eyed helmets shifted, forming new crests that glowed with pure white light. The knights picked up their heavy cleavers, but instead of the dark, physical mass of the sword logic, the blades crackled with arcs of blue electrical energy and purple void matter. Savathûn successfully bonded the traveler's light to her own species. She had broken the eternal biological pact with the worm gods and manufactured a new army, fueled by the very power the light-bearers used against her brother. Her new warriors, now called the Lucent Brood, marched in perfectly synchronized rows across the white courtyards, their smooth armor reflecting the bright energy of their ghosts. Savathûn sat on a throne carved from solid white stone, watching her glowing army assemble. She had secured a permanent, self-sustaining energy source, but the physical reality of the Sol system remained. The vanguard commanders in the last city possessed exactly the same power, and they had just aimed their iron rifles at her previous disguise. Savathûn stood up from her throne, ordering her Lucent knights to fortify the stained glass corridors and prepare their electrical blades for the inevitable physical arrival of the Earth's light-bearers. Savathûn anchored a massive flagship in the orbit of Mars. She observed the grey dust and deep craters of the lunar surface through the ship's optical sensors, watching the vanguard jump ships land near the Scarlet Keep. The light-bearers stepped out of their ships onto the regolith. They wore heavy ceramic chest plates and carried kinetic rifles. They walked toward the tall red fortress, aiming their weapons at the massive iron doors. Savathûn required a physical manifestation of her newly acquired light to combat them. She walked into the deep spawning pits of her flagship. The pits contained hundreds of dead, unbonded ghosts she had collected. She directed her wizards to drop the metal shells into pools of thick, glowing white fluid. The wizards chanted, layering acoustic frequencies over the pools, and the white fluid seeped into the glass cores of the ghosts. The metal shell pieces expanded and reshaped into jagged, chitin-like armor, and the central glass cores ignited with the pure white energy of the traveler. The altered ghosts floated out of the pools, their blue optical sensors blinking. They drifted through the damp corridors of the ship and found the piles of dead hive knights and acolytes. The ghosts projected concentrated beams of light over the corpses. The radiation fused the cracked bone and reknitted the torn muscle tissue. The hive warriors stood up, their chitin shifting from dark grey to bright alabaster white. Their green eyes burned with white fire. Savathûn commanded these new light-infused warriors, the Lucent Brood, to board their angular dropships and descend to the surface of Mars. The vanguard light-bearers marched across the red sand of the Martian dunes. They crested a steep ridge and stopped. The Lucent Brood stood in formation at the base of the ridge. The white armor of the hive warriors reflected the harsh sunlight. A Lucent knight stepped forward. It did not swing a heavy iron cleaver. Instead, the knight raised its hands and gathered ambient void energy from the atmosphere. It formed a massive glowing purple shield and threw it directly at the light-bearers. The shield struck a human titan in the chest, shattering his ceramic armor and knocking him backward into the sand. A lucent acolyte raised its arms and summoned a volley of flaming solar knives, launching the burning projectiles into the light-bearers' ranks. The intense heat melted the barrels of their kinetic rifles and scorched their woven jackets. A human hunter drew a hand cannon and fired a heavy tungsten slug into the optical cluster of the lucent knight. The knight collapsed onto the sand. Instantly, the knight's chitin-covered ghost materialized above its body. The ghost projected a beam of white light downward, beginning the physical reconstruction of the knight's shattered skull. The light-bearers watched the bone rapidly fusing back together. The hunter ran forward, dropped his hand cannon, and grabbed the hovering ghost with both hands. He squeezed the metal shell tightly, his armored gauntlets crushing the glass core. The ghost shattered into sharp fragments, and the white light extinguished. The Hive Knight remained dead on the sand, its body slowly turning to ash. Savathûn observed the skirmish from the bridge of her flagship. She recorded the physical destruction of her ghosts and the methods the light-bearers used to permanently kill her brood. She turned her attention to the massive black pyramid ship buried beneath the red Martian dust. This pyramid belonged to the Black Fleet, the physical manifestations of the darkness that directly opposed the traveler. Savathûn needed to secure her throne world and her new light from the encroaching fleets of both the Vanguard and the Darkness. She instructed her wizards to weave a complex illusion across the entire planet of Mars. The wizards channeled their energy, projecting a massive spatial distortion field that pulled the physical mass of the planet into a localized pocket of the ascendant plane, hiding the red dunes and the buried pyramid ship from the optical sensors of the Vanguard and the Black Fleet. Simultaneously, she ordered her hive engineers to pull her massive alabaster fortress out of the ascendant plane and anchor it directly into the physical space previously occupied by Mars. The white stone towers and reflecting pools of her throne world materialized in the vacuum of space. Savathûn stood on the highest balcony of her fortress, watching the stars align around her new physical domain. She had physically relocated her entire power base into the material universe. She raised her hands, channeling the light through her veins, and cast a dense white barrier of energy around the perimeter of her throne world, sealing the alabaster stone behind a wall of pure radiation, ready to physically defend her new kingdom against the inevitable Vanguard assault. The Vanguard light-bearers maintained a steady orbital blockade above Mars. They piloted heavily armored jump ships, monitoring the dark void where the red planet previously existed. Savathûn's massive alabaster throne world floated in the center of the blockade. The white stone walls and high archways remained sealed behind the thick barrier of concentrated light. A small fire team of light-bearers boarded an angular metal shuttle and bypassed the blockade. They ignited their plasma thrusters, driving the nose of the shuttle directly through the glowing white barrier. The intense radiation scorched the metal hull, stripping the black paint and warping the exterior plating. The shuttle breached the energy field and landed on the smooth quartz surface of Savathûn's central courtyard. The light-bearers stepped out onto the polished stone. They carried kinetic rifles and heavy rocket launchers. They walked past the reflecting pools and entered the main corridor of the fortress. The walls consisted of white alabaster, completely lacking the rotting biological matter typical of hive architecture. A group of lucent knights stood guard at the end of the hall. The knights wore smooth white armor and carried long metal cleavers crackling with electrical energy. The light-bearers raised their kinetic rifles and fired streams of tungsten slugs. The slugs shattered the white armor plates, driving deep into the knights' chests. The knights collapsed onto the floor. Immediately, their metal ghosts materialized above the bodies, projecting cones of reconstructive blue light over the shattered chitin. The light-bearers slung their rifles over their shoulders. They sprinted forward, dodging the electrical arcs emitted by the dying knights. They reached out with heavy armored gauntlets, grabbing the hovering ghosts tightly in their hands. They applied physical pressure, crushing the delicate glass cores inside the metal shells. The glass shattered, and the blue light extinguished, leaving the Hive Knights permanently dead on the alabaster stone. The light-bearers advanced deeper into the throne world, navigating the wide staircases and stained glass corridors. They encountered massive physical puzzles constructed by Savathûn's wizards. The wizards utilized light-bending crystals and sonic resonators to project false walls and hide the true physical path through the fortress. The light-bearers scanned the environment using the optical sensors of their own ghosts. They identified the structural inconsistencies in the physical projections, firing their weapons at the hidden crystal arrays. The crystals shattered under the kinetic fire, dissolving the false walls and exposing the hidden doorways. Savathûn sat on her high white throne, observing the light-bearers' progress through her optical sensors. The constant flow of the traveler's light through her veins replaced the gnawing hunger of her previous parasite. She did not require the biological mass of the slain light-bearers, nor did she need the chemical reaction generated by their deception. She stood up, gripping a long staff forged from solid white bone. The light-bearers reached the central chamber of the fortress. They stepped into the massive circular room, their boots clicking against the smooth quartz. Savathûn stepped down from her throne, her massive white armor plates shifting with every step. She raised her bone staff and channeled the pure solar energy of the light. The air in the chamber superheated instantly, causing the metal barrels of the light-bearers' rifles to glow red. Savathûn fired a concentrated beam of white fire directly at the central light-bearer. The Guardian threw up a thick wall of purple void energy, intercepting the blast. The collision generated a massive shockwave, cracking the alabaster floor and shattering the stained glass windows along the ceiling. The light-bearers spread out, utilizing the scattered stone debris for physical cover. They loaded explosive warheads into their rocket launchers and fired directly at Savathûn's broad chest plates. The rockets detonated against her armor, the explosive force tearing large chunks of white chitin away from her body. The physical trauma did not slow her movements. Her mechanical ghost hovered near the ceiling, constantly pumping reconstructive energy downward, sealing the cracks in her armor as quickly as the light-bearers inflicted them. Savathûn swung her heavy bone staff, generating a localized electrical storm that arched across the metal armor of the vanguard forces, burning their skin and shorting out their communications gear. The physical confrontation escalated, transforming the pristine white chamber into a heavily damaged arena filled with broken glass, scorched stone, and the constant, blinding flashes of weaponized light. Savathûn spread her massive arms and pulled a dense layer of purple void energy over the alabaster quartz floor. The light-bearers stepped forward, their heavy boots sinking into the thick, dark matter. The void energy restricted their physical movements, slowing the swing of their arms and preventing them from reaching the triggers of their rocket launchers. Savathûn raised her bone staff again, aiming the curved end toward the ceiling. A wide circle of white light expanded directly above the light-bearers. She directed a concentrated barrage of arc energy straight down. The blue electrical bolts struck the light-bearers' shoulders and helmets, completely draining their kinetic shields and sending them collapsing onto their knees. Savathûn stepped out of the violet pool, her white armor plates clicking together. She looked down at the immobilized fire team. She pointed her staff at the center of the chamber, creating a swirling physical vortex in the air. The vortex rotated rapidly, sucking the scattered stone dust and glass fragments into a tight spiral. 3 towering figures stepped out of the swirling dust. They possessed thick, interlocking armor plates and carried heavy iron swords. They mirrored the physical dimensions of Hive Knights, but their armor glowed with pure white light instead of dark chitin. These were the light-infused projections of her lucent brood, summoned directly from the ambient energy of her throne world. The projections swung their heavy swords downward, striking the light-bearers across their ceramic chest plates. The impact sent the guardians sliding across the quartz, leaving deep gouges in the polished stone. The light-bearers pushed themselves up, bracing their boots against the floor. They generated spheres of concentrated solar energy in their palms and threw them at the projections. The thermal blasts detonated against the white armor, melting the outer layers of the solid light. The projections did not falter. They raised their hands and channeled beams of concentrated solar fire back at the light-bearers, perfectly replicating the physical attacks of the vanguard warriors. Savathûn watched the exchange of thermal energy from the edge of the chamber. She recorded the physical limits of the Guardians' light, documenting exactly how much solar radiation their armor could withstand before the ceramic plating cracked and the internal cooling systems failed. She struck the base of her staff against the stone floor. The vibrations spread through the quartz, triggering a series of heavy mechanical locks in the chamber's ceiling. Massive chunks of raw alabaster fell from the high arches, crashing into the purple void pool and crushing the light-bearers beneath tons of solid rock. The light-bearers' ghosts materialized above the rubble, projecting their blue reconstructive beams. Savathûn did not order her projections to crush the metal shells. Instead, she extended her hand and cast a wide dome of translucent white light over the entire pile of debris. The dome functioned as a physical suppression field, completely sealing the ghosts inside. The mechanical constructs spun their shell pieces, accelerating their processing cores and attempting to push their light through the barrier. The white dome absorbed their energy, remaining completely solid and trapping the light-bearers beneath the stone. With the vanguard fire team physically contained, Savathûn turned and walked toward the massive stained glass window at the rear of the chamber. She looked through the thick, colored panes at the void of space outside. The physical structure of her throne world hung securely in the material universe, anchored directly into the empty space of Mars. The traveler's light flowed continuously through her veins, sustaining her body and powering her lucent brood without the need for endless biological consumption. She had severed the eternal pact, abandoned the sword logic, and claimed the power of her enemies. She gripped her bone staff, tracing the physical lines of the white energy pulsing through the wood, and prepared to expand the borders of her alabaster fortress outward into the physical territory of the Sol system. Savathûn directed the physical expansion of her throne world directly into the neural pathways of the captured light-bearers. She did not utilize heavy blades to extract their information. Instead, her wizards strapped the unconscious guardians to upright stone slabs and attached biological leeches directly to their temples. The leeches drilled through the ceramic helmets and tapped into the cerebrospinal fluid, transferring the chemical memory engrams from the human brains into Savathûn's personal viewing chambers. She stood in a dark room lined with glass vats, plunging her hands into the extracted fluid. She reviewed the visual data of the Guardians' memories, specifically targeting their encounters with the lunar pyramid ship and the dark, faceless statues inside. The visual memories detailed a physical fleet of black, triangular vessels hovering in the cold vacuum of space, waiting at the edge of the Sol system. These vessels belonged to the Witness, the guiding consciousness of the Black Fleet, the very entity that had originally instructed the worm gods to trap her species on Fundament millions of years ago. She pulled her hands from the vats, the thick fluid dripping from her long fingers onto the alabaster tiles. The Black Fleet had arrived in the Sol system to finalize their physical consumption of the universe. The Witness employed a disciple named Rulk, a massive entity clad in dark metal armor who had subjugated the worm gods and monitored the hive's progress for millennia. Rulk anchored a massive pyramid ship in the swamps of Savathûn's throne world, attempting to enforce the sword logic and override her new light-based architecture. A massive, jagged black root structure grew from the base of the pyramid, burrowing deep into the white quartz foundation of her fortress. The roots secreted a dark, resonant energy, fracturing the smooth alabaster walls and spawning dark, distorted manifestations of her dead broods. Savathûn recognized the physical threat to her domain. Rulk intended to detonate a weapon called the Upended, a resonant superweapon designed to completely shatter her entire throne world and drag the floating fragments back into the dark matter of the Ascendant Plane. Savathûn utilized the Vanguard Lightbearers to neutralize this internal threat. She adjusted the frequency of the protective light barrier surrounding her fortress, allowing a specific fire team of guardians to pass through the energy field and land their ships in the swamp outside the pyramid. The light-bearers navigated the dark root structures, firing kinetic slugs and solar blasts into the twisted manifestations guarding the entrance. They breached the heavy stone doors of the pyramid and descended into the deep, metallic corridors. They encountered Rulk in the central arena, a wide, flat platform suspended over a bottomless chasm. Rulk swung a long, double-bladed glaive, generating waves of dark, resonant energy that cracked the ceramic armor of the light-bearers and pushed them toward the edge of the platform. The light-bearers counteracted the resonant blasts by physically absorbing the dark energy. They stood directly in the path of the waves, allowing the resonance to penetrate their armor and saturate their bloodstreams. Before the dark energy could rupture their cellular structures, they discharged the stored resonance directly into the crystalline power conduits lining the arena walls. The resulting feedback loop overloaded the upended superweapon, causing the central core to detonate inward. The blast shattered Rulk's dark metal armor, exposing his physical body to concentrated crossfire. The light-bearers aimed their rocket launchers and kinetic rifles at his exposed chest, firing continuously until his massive frame collapsed onto the metal platform and dissolved into a thick cloud of black smoke. Savathûn observed the destruction of the disciple from the high balcony of her white fortress. The dark root structures in the swamp withered and crumbled into dry dust. The structural integrity of her throne world restabilized, the cracks in the alabaster walls sealing shut. She had effectively weaponized the light-bearers to remove the primary agent of the Witness from her domain, utilizing their physical strength and their access to the Traveler's light without requiring any direct communication or formal alliance. She pressed her hand against the smooth white stone of the balcony rail. The Black Fleet remained stationed throughout the outer planets of the Sol system, but their direct line of influence into her throne world was severed. She turned her attention back to the central objective. The Traveler, the massive white sphere, still hung in the sky above the earth. Savathûn did not intend to simply mimic its power. She planned to physically relocate the entity. She ordered her wizards to construct a massive web of thick, glowing light threads, anchoring the base of the web deep into the quartz foundation of her throne world. She calculated the precise physical coordinates required to drag the massive sphere through a dimensional tear and lock it permanently within her sealed domain. The physical transfer of the traveler would secure the source of the light, protecting it from the Black Fleet, while simultaneously cutting off the vanguard light-bearers from their own biological regeneration. She raised her bone staff, striking the floor, and initiating the massive ritual, preparing to pull the white moon out of the Earth's sky and bind it tightly within her alabaster fortress. Savathûn brought the heavy bone staff down against the quartz floor. The impact sent a visible ripple of white energy outward, expanding across the alabaster courtyards and shattering the remaining stained glass windows. Above the Earth, the massive white sphere of the traveler began to shift. The physical webbing of light threads Savathûn had constructed wrapped entirely around its metallic outer shell. The threads pulled tight, tearing the traveler from its geostationary orbit. The massive sphere dragged through the vacuum of space, passing directly through the dimensional tear and appearing in the sky above Savathûn's throne world. The sheer physical mass of the traveler displaced the atmosphere inside the ascendant plane, generating heavy shockwaves that leveled the surrounding alabaster towers and turned the reflecting pools into boiling steam. The vanguard light-bearers watched the traveler vanish from the Earth's sky. The immediate severing of their primary light source caused the blue optical sensors on their mechanical ghosts to dim rapidly. Their ceramic armor grew heavy, and the solar plasma coils in their kinetic rifles cooled and deactivated. They boarded their dropships and followed the physical trajectory of the dimensional tear, pushing their vessels through the closing portal and crashing onto the shattered quartz plains of the throne world. They emerged from the wreckage, their boots stepping over the pulverized white stone. They looked up and saw the traveler suspended in the center of the massive web of light, directly above Savathûn's central courtyard. The light-bearers advanced toward the courtyard, moving slowly, without the constant biological regeneration provided by the traveler. Savathûn deployed her lucent brood. The light-infused hive knights and acolytes marched in strict geometric formations, their white armor reflecting the harsh glare of the captured sphere. The hive knights raised their hands, summoning concentrated walls of void energy and throwing massive, spinning arc shields directly at the vanguard forces. The light-bearers raised their heavy rocket launchers, manually loading the explosive warheads without the automated assistance of their ghosts. They fired the rockets into the center of the hive formations, shattering the white chitin plates and exposing the glowing bones beneath. When the lucent knights fell, their hive ghosts hovered above the bodies, projecting the blue reconstructive light. The vanguard light-bearers sprinted forward, ignoring the electrical burns scorching their skin. They grabbed the metal shells and crushed the glass cores, permanently ending the hive resurrections. They fought their way across the courtyard, stepping over the piles of white ash and shattered weapons. They reached the base of the central platform where Savathûn stood. She raised her bone staff, channeling a continuous stream of pure solar fire directly into the web of light, pulling the traveler deeper into her domain. The light-bearers spread out around the platform. They aimed their kinetic rifles at the glowing anchor points, connecting the web to the quartz foundation. They fired concentrated bursts of tungsten slugs, fracturing the physical tethers. As the anchor points snapped, the web of light loosened, causing the massive sphere to drop slightly in the sky. Savathûn turned her optical sensors toward the light-bearers. She swung her staff, releasing a wide arc of destructive void energy that swept across the platform. The purple wave struck the light-bearers, lifting them off the stone and throwing them violently against the alabaster walls. Their heavy armor cracked, and their internal communications gear sparked and failed. Savathûn stepped to the edge of the platform. She looked down at the battered fire team. She possessed the physical power of the light, and the massive sphere hovered securely within her borders. She raised her staff to deliver the final kinetic blow. The light-bearers pulled themselves up from the debris. They bypassed their damaged armor systems and physically engaged the remaining anchor points of the web. They drove the empty barrels of their kinetic rifles directly into the glowing tethers, using their own body weight to pry the physical connections out of the quartz foundation. The last anchor snapped. The web of light completely unraveled, and the traveler dropped heavily toward the surface of the throne world. The massive sphere corrected its trajectory, emitting a blinding flash of white radiation that momentarily blinded Savathûn and vaporized the remaining lucent knights in the courtyard. The traveler accelerated upward, tearing back through the dimensional rift and returning to its original orbit above the Earth. Savathûn watched the white sphere vanish. The sudden absence of the massive energy source disrupted the flow of light through her veins. Her white armor plates dimmed, and the glow faded from her green eyes. The Vanguard light-bearers reloaded their heavy rocket launchers, aiming the wide barrels directly at her broad chest. They fired simultaneously. The explosive warheads detonated against her alabaster chitin, tearing the thick plates apart and crushing her internal organs. The physical trauma overwhelmed her remaining cellular structure. Savathûn collapsed onto the cracked quartz floor, her massive body hitting the stone with a heavy thud. Her white ghost materialized above her corpse, its blue optical sensor blinking rapidly. The ghost scanned the shattered bone and torn muscle, preparing to project the reconstructive blue light. But the Vanguard light-bearers stepped forward, their heavy boots crushing the stone dust beneath them, their armored hands reaching out to claim the mechanical shell. The armored gauntlets of the Vanguard light-bearers closed around the vacant space above the alabaster corpse. The white ghost rotated its metal shell pieces outward, emitting a concentrated burst of blinding solar radiation. The intense light forced the light-bearers to shield their optical sensors. The mechanical construct utilized the burst to initiate a rapid transmat sequence, converting its physical mass into data and departing completely from the throne world chamber. The light-bearers lowered their hands and looked down at the massive, motionless body of the Hive Queen. The white chitin plates lay fractured across the quartz floor, spilling bright, glowing biological fluid onto the stone. The Vanguard commanders initiated their short-range radios, broadcasting specific coordinates to the orbital blockade outside the dimensional rift. Heavy Vanguard transport ships descended through the shattered stained glass ceiling of the throne world. The thrusters burned the remaining void energy pools into thick smoke. The metal landing gear struck the quartz platform with a resounding crash. Dozens of Titans wearing thick plasteel armor stepped out of the cargo bays, uncoiling thick steel cables and heavy titanium chains. They wrapped the chains around Savathûn's dense limbs and torso, securing the heavy alabaster plates. The transport cranes engaged their mechanical winches, pulling the cables taut and lifting the massive biological form off the ground. The ships hauled the body into their pressurized cargo holds, locking the iron doors and igniting their main engines to transport the physical remains back to the last city. Inside a subterranean laboratory beneath the Vanguard headquarters, technicians in sealed hazard suits stood around a reinforced titanium dissection table. The transport ships delivered Savathûn's corpse to this secure facility, suspending the heavy body within a localized anti-gravity field. The technicians activated high-powered optical magnifiers and laser scalpels. They directed the superheated lasers along the fractures in the white chitin, peeling back the thick armor to expose the internal muscle tissue and skeletal structure. They extracted fluid samples using long glass syringes, depositing the glowing liquids into centrifuges for chemical analysis. The centrifuges spun rapidly, separating the biological components from the pure light radiation. The laboratory readouts displayed the vacant abdominal cavity and the smooth, healed tissue along the spinal column where the parasite previously resided. The chemical monitors showed a massive saturation of traveler's light embedded directly into the bone marrow and nervous system. The biological cells retained their pristine structure, preserved completely by the residual radiation of the light. The vanguard scientists recorded the physical density of the white armor, recognizing the exact cellular replication of the energy strictly reserved for human light-bearers. They documented the physical transformation of the hive biology, filing the reports on solid-state drives and storing them in the deep Vanguard archives. Furthermore, they locked the tissue samples inside lead-lined refrigerated units to observe the long-term effects of the solar radiation on the hive biology. Meanwhile, the surviving lucent brood maintained their physical hold over the alabaster throne world. The light-infused hive knights and acolytes patrolled the smooth white corridors and reflecting pools. They continued to resurrect their fallen warriors using the captured ghosts, replacing the broken weapons and rebuilding the shattered walls. The physical architecture of the fortress remained anchored in the material universe, drawing ambient energy from the surrounding space. The free white ghost hovered somewhere within the dark matter of the ascendant plane, retaining the exact biological template required to reconstruct Savathûn's physical body upon a future return. Consequently, the Vanguard sealed the subterranean laboratory behind thick iron vault doors. They stationed heavily armed tactical units at the perimeter, keeping their kinetic rifles aimed at the metal threshold. The physical containment of the body blocked the ghost from accessing the biological mass. Savathûn's optical sensors remained dark, and her heavy limbs hung motionless in the anti-gravity field. The deep cuts from the laser scalpels exposed the glowing white marrow of her ribs to the sterile air of the room. The physical form of the Witch Queen rested entirely under the control of the human forces, secured inside the concrete foundation of the city. Simultaneously, the Black Fleet continued its forward trajectory through the outer edges of the Sol system. The massive Black Pyramid ships bypassed the frozen moons of Jupiter and Saturn, moving steadily toward the inner planets. The ambient resonance from the ships generated massive gravitational waves, pulling rogue asteroids out of orbit and fracturing the ice crusts of nearby satellites. The Witness directed the physical advancement of the vessels, focusing the fleet's optical sensors directly on the traveler hovering above the last city. The Vanguard commanders stood at their glowing holotables, tracking the incoming gravitational anomalies generated by the pyramid ships. They initiated city-wide defensive protocols, distributing heavy munitions and reinforcing the concrete walls with layered steel barricades. The physical reality of the universe shifted, aligning the massive biological armies and the mechanical fleets for an impending collision. The preserved corpse in the subterranean vault held the detailed physical records of the enemy's biological vulnerabilities, and the light-bearers prepared to utilize those chemical secrets in the approaching war. Deep within the ascendant plane, the white ghost hovered above the fractured quartz floor of the alabaster courtyard. The mechanical shell pieces rotated slowly around the glowing blue optical sensor, reflecting the dim ambient light of the shifting dark matter above. The construct emitted a continuous, low-frequency hum, scanning the physical debris left behind by the Vanguard rockets. It projected a thin beam of blue light onto the stone, tracing the residual radiation of Savathûn's physical mass. The ghost encoded the exact biological structure, bone density, and light saturation levels into its internal glass processor. Furthermore, it retreated into the deep, dark matter surrounding the throne world, floating silently among the loose rock fragments and drifting dust. It maintained a constant holding pattern in the absolute silence of the void, preserving the exact data required to rebuild the Witch Queen's thick chitin and dense muscle tissue. Back on Earth, the Vanguard commanders stood inside the steel and concrete walls of their Tactical Operations Center. The heavy server banks hummed steadily, pumping warm exhaust through the metal grating in the floor. They examined the glowing blue projections hovering above the central holotable, the light illuminating the deep wrinkles on their faces. The readouts displayed the massive physical dimensions of the Black Pyramid ships, crossing the orbit of Jupiter. Zavala leaned over the table, pressing his heavy armored gauntlets against the metal rim. He transmitted vocal commands through his encrypted radio channels, ordering the deployment of heavily armored dropships to the perimeter of the last city. The light-bearers loaded high-explosive ordnance into their weapons and reinforced the stone and steel barricades along the city walls. They welded thick iron plates over the defensive emplacements, constructing a dense physical barrier against the advancing resonant energy. Directly below the command center, Savathûn's massive corpse rested on the titanium dissection table. The subterranean vault remained completely sealed behind 3 layers of thick iron doors. The sterile air inside the room circulated through heavy filtration vents, blowing across the exposed white bone and torn tissue of the open chest cavity. The low hum of the anti-gravity field filled the room, suspending the heavy limbs inches above the metal surface. The cuts from the laser scalpels revealed the dense marrow and the complex network of severed optical nerves. The physical frame laid motionless under the bright fluorescent bulbs, completely isolated from the traveler's solar radiation and the dark matter of the ascendant plane. The Vanguard technicians monitored the chemical degradation of the chitin plates, logging the biological data onto solid-state hard drives. The dead body served as a static, physical archive of engineered biology and stolen light. The massive pyramid ships closed the physical distance to the Earth, passing silently through the vacuum of space and casting deep geometric shadows across the craters of the moon. The gravitational anomalies generated by the Black Fleet fractured the surrounding asteroids, sending massive chunks of rock spinning out of orbit. Savathûn's previous manipulation of the Vanguard light-bearers had successfully eliminated the disciple Rook, destroying the immediate internal threat to her domain and disrupting the Black Fleet's advance. Her engineered Lucent brood maintained their defensive positions along the alabaster walls of her throne world, swinging their arc-infused blades and holding the captured territory. The physical collision between the Earth's light-bearers and the pyramid ships approached rapidly, driven by the massive kinetic force of the encroaching fleet. The physical records remain locked inside the concrete vault, and the white ghost continues to float in the dark matter. The Hive Queen's physical body lies dissected and contained, while her biological template persists securely inside the mechanical construct. The tactical screens in the Vanguard Tower display the encroaching fleet, forcing the light-bearers to construct heavier barricades and load denser munitions. The massive mechanical ships and concentrated resonant energy move directly toward the concrete walls of the last city. The embers in the fire pit crackle, sending small orange sparks drifting upward into the cold night air. The heavy logs shift and settle, radiating a steady, warm heat across the stone floor. The sky above the last city hangs clear and quiet, with the massive white sphere of the traveler reflecting the distant starlight. Wars require the continuous swinging of heavy blades and the constant loading of kinetic rifles. You have carried your heavy armor across many battlefields, and you have fought the dark formations across the frozen moons and dusty planets. You must lower your weapons and rest your muscles to prepare for the heavy impacts to come. The flames will continue to burn, warming the physical space around you. Take this time to repair your torn woven armor and let your cellular structure recover. Thank you for sitting by the fire and listening to this story. Take your rest and sleep well until the next dawn.